Class, today we are on to lesson 4 from unit number 1, Fundamentals of Economics, and today's lesson is on political economies. But before we start today's lesson, let's make sure we go over your homework to ensure that you know what happened last lesson and you are up to date and up to speed with what's going on. Question number 1 dealt with tangible versus intangible resources. Question number 2 talks about what the different types of capital, real capital versus money capital, and then also later we'll look into human capital. Question number 3 talks about why is political stability important. And then number 4, we looked at what entrepreneurship is and how it, helps economies grow. The next set of questions was answered here. What is an economy? And then talks about, I think this question number 5 was about a mixed market economy, about Canada. So as we go on to today's lesson, let's make sure we know what our learning goals are. 1, know how to distinguish between political economies. 2, be able to evaluate different economic goals. 3, understand why different economies value different things. And our success criteria, there's going to be some team teaching again, just like the previous lesson, and of course, always completion of review and homework. So let's get on with today's lesson. So today we start with political economies, and so we have to understand some very important components that you've probably encountered before, but let's make sure we review them. So 1 is democracy. I think we all know what democracy is. Democracy we have in Canada. It is a system characterized by a freely elected government. It's very important to understand that we have to be freely elected. And so there are some countries that claim to be democratic, yet the election process is not exactly free, and citizens are pressured in voting a certain way. At times there's only one name on a ballot, so they say democratic, yet in reality the process is not democratic at all, but they want to be called democratic nations. Okay, but like Canada, we are democratic. People vote. There's no pressure or fear of hardship or death, even if you vote a different way or you show opposition. And that is in opposition to dictatorship. Dictatorship is a system which a single party or individual has absolute power over a nation, right? So think about parties like or countries like North Korea, right? This is a family that's been in power for generations upon generations. And even these days, they're talking about the current leader of North Korea. There's lots of questions marks about his health, if he's even still alive sometimes, and they're saying now it's just going to go straight to his sister. And so these are dictatorships where opposition parties cannot gain any ground and oftentimes for fear of death. Okay, and so it's very important to understand that these are two, extreme versions of how political economies get elected or get in power. So the first system that we're going to look at is communism. And so I'm going to go over a few points, maybe look at and talk about some pros and some cons. This is obviously not going to be an extensive list. This is just various points that have been brought forth in the past. You want to make sure you read the text to ensure you know everything, or at least what the text says about communism, and also to bring forth some of your own thoughts in terms of what it is. And so Karl Marx, Engels, and Lenin were some of the economists and leaders that talked about communism. And so the first point is that communism involves a strong centralized government. Okay, and so what do we mean by centralized? We mean that there is central control. So the decisions and the outcomes are controlled by a group in the government. Could be really an individual, it could be a political party, but that party or individual controls the choices and decisions about what's made throughout the entire country. And that leads to community ownership and wealth. So what do I mean by community ownership? It means that the nation owns everything. And so this is in opposition to private ownership. An extreme communist system is going to say that everything belongs to everyone, effectively controlled by the government or the central power that chooses what resources to go where, who gets it, all these kinds of things. And so they control and decide what everyone does and how much everyone makes, and they control all means of production and wealth. Third point is, in these systems, again, they're extreme systems. only produce what is needed and consume according to need. So if you can produce well, you produce, and then you're given what you need to survive or to be healthy. So there's less of a capitalistic, consumeristic nature in this system. A strong point is that they use force to achieve order, and so if you don't want to go along with what they say or what they believe, they're going to use some sort of power to coerce you to go along, or to put you in jail, or kill you, or whatnot, to ensure that their political system and ideology stays in place. Next point is extreme left wing, and we'll talk about this in a minute. The last point is no opposition allowed, hence the using force to achieve order. So if an opposition party arises, or an opposition group arises, it's likely that they're going to be met with force. Think about here in Canada, an opposition party can arise, right, and say whatever they want, really. The reigning power is not sending the military after them to quiet them, but in a extreme left-wing communist party, if you rise in power and try to usurp them or take power away from them, you're likely to be met with force and power, and your opposition is going to be, beat down and not allowed to gain power and gain a following. So let's look at a few of the maybe pros and cons. So obviously, let's look at some of the cons right away. So using force to achieve order, no opposition. Those are pretty bad things, right? So this causes and can lead to corruption potentially. It can lead to standard of living getting lower for certain types of people. There's people not having a voice. Your community being fearful. All these kinds of things are not ideal methods to rule your nation. But let's look at some of the pros, right? So what are good things about this system? Central control allows for centralized, governmental run organizations. And while some may argue against that, think about things like public healthcare, public schools, military. These kinds of things are not privatized. They are controlled by the government. Designed, developed for everyone to use, for everyone to make use of and to benefit from, right? So only centralized systems can accomplish some of these tasks. Maybe not only, but oftentimes they can achieve it better. And so the only produce what is needed, consume according to need. So this can go both ways. Some see this as a very good thing, yet others talk about how this demotivates individuals, right? So capitalism, which we're going to go over in a couple slides, helps to look at motivation, what motivates individuals to produce, to do things. But a communist or left-wing system is going to try to make things fair for all, right? And when you think of communism, you think about the central government or the people in power taking more, right? And so we think about things like that, where there are people at the top that are maybe corrupt or that are selfish. And so every system, whether it be communism or the other systems we'll talk about next, if the people in power are corrupt and are not good, there are going to be people who are exploited and marginalized. And so you want to take away the corruption, you can't, but from the actual theory. Yes, the force to achieve order, no opposition allowed, those are problematic things, not democratic at all, not for the people. The people don't get a vote, so that's bad. But some of the other things are actually good, but are seen as bad because of what negative individuals at the top may do. So it's very important to see the theory or the idea in itself versus, and take it away from the people who may corrupt the idea. Okay. The next political economy that we're going to talk about is socialism. And socialism has some similarities to communism and some very, very drastic differences that are not very similar to communism. So socialism talks about no monopoly power. So you don't want kind of capitalistic privatized structures to exploit prices. They want equality for all. They want people to be enjoying the fruits of the whole, shared resources. Again, this is very similar to communist ideology, this left-wingist ideology, right, where our community shares everything, where people all get to consume and to be reaping the rewards of the nation. Public ownership, right? Not privatized, right? Lots of public services, lots of welfare states, all those kinds of things. This is moderate left. And so if you remember from the previous slide, communism was extreme left. And so it's important to understand communism is the extreme, socialism is the moderate, yet they're both left. It's democratic, so this is very different than communism. So it's voted on. It is a system where people can vote for whoever they want to be in power. Theoretically more efficient. Again, this is a very arguable fact or arguable statement. There's efficiency in central control. There's an efficiency in being able to create a national highway system, whereas privatization maybe is not going to be able to do it as well. But as you'll see later, privatization is can be and often is much more efficient than the centralized control, the government systems. And again, you'll see it in your daily lives where these governmental programs are far less efficient than some of the privatized ones. But that's a different conversation a little bit. Shared resources and work. So again, we're public ownership. Everyone gets to use everything. We all work to similar communal goals. There are no capital markets. There is no private ownership, similar to communism. Solidarity. We all work for the state. We all work for the common goal. Similar to communism, we all work for the nation versus work for the individual. The individual is downplayed while the nation is the most important thing, right? Both communism and socialism focus on the public good, not private good, not consumer goods. It's peaceful, which is a drastic difference than the communist system where it's no opposition and force is used, and equal distribution of wealth. And so when you think of the Scandinavian nations, they're more socialistic. Wealth is distributed. That wealth gap that's often talked about is smaller. There's less of the uber wealthy and less of the very, very poor. And so I would say that there are all, again, positives and negatives to socialism, right? So again, lots of this is positive to me. Equal distribution of wealth, I like this, right? Again, some people might say this is a negative thing. Some people will say that equal distribution of wealth is a demotivator for privatized people to do more, achieve more, to innovate and all these kinds of things. And again, there's going to be credible backing to that theory. Peaceful, very good. I hope everyone could agree. Peaceful is very good. No capital markets, problematic in terms of innovation and progress. Efficient, arguable. Central control, socialist nature type things is useful and efficient, but privatization is also very efficient. Democracy is good, public ownership can be good, equality is great, all those kinds of things. And so when you think of socialism, and like I said, you think of the Scandinavian countries, lots of those nations have very, very high standard of living in terms of satisfaction of their people. While it might not be the richest nations or the most economically prosperous nations, they are often people who are highest on the scale of life satisfaction and happiness, right? And so, again, this is all about what are your goals? What do you want to have? What do you think is most important, right? And so we're trying to figure out, again, for economics, what's the best way to use our scarce resources, right? To satisfy our people, right? Do we want all of our people to be doing well? Do we want only the individuals who are capable to do well? So again, these are all questions that we need to examine as we look more at economics as a field of study. The third that we're going to look at is capitalism. So capitalism, we're going to talk about in the view of Adam Smith. And so we'll talk about Adam Smith in the next lesson quite a bit. But capitalism is all about private ownership, okay? Capitalism is all about doing what you can for the best for yourself, for lack of better words, right? It's democratic, which is great. There are free markets, so when we think about capitalism, we think about the United States. People can start businesses, they can own property, they can do whatever they want, essentially, as long as it's within the law. People can vote, markets are free, People produce for profit, right? So now this is where we kind of shift away from that left-wing notion where people produce for profit for self-betterment versus produce for the greater good of all community, right? And so that's the difference between these two. Capitalism utilizes natural order or natural laws, and so we'll talk about this a lot next lesson, but it talks about how you're motivated by your own self-interest, right? You produce for profit, therefore you're going to want to innovate more, you're going to produce faster, you're going to produce better, and that's going to push economies. And you're going to see throughout history, nations that are more capitalistic, not theoretically, they grow faster. Their GDP is going to grow faster, right? There is definite correlation between these kinds of nations growing. But again, what are your goals, right? Is the growth in economy worth the sacrifice of, let's say, the environment, right? So you can't look at some of these things and think of them statically. You have to think of this greater, bigger picture as a whole to do a full economic analysis. It's moderate right, again, communism, extreme left, socialism, moderate left, now capitalism, moderate right. The moderate being democratic and being non-violent, right being this accumulation of wealth, profit, free markets, private ownership, right? And so that's what we're talking about. And so now we're going to start talking about capital, right? So in capitalism, people want to accumulate capital. People want to accumulate means of production. Why? To make themselves more wealthy, right? I want to build this factory. I want to invest in these things because I want my business to grow. I want to get wealthier for myself. And maybe it's not about also always about wealth. Maybe it's about just growing business. But when you look at the left wing, you look at accumulation of capital for greater good for the community or for the nation, right? Building these infrastructure projects like roads, building good systems of sewage. All these kinds of things are for the greater good versus for the individual good. Okay? Examples would be like US and Hong Kong. And so I want to contrast China here. Before, historically, China has been known as a communist nation, right? But when did they start becoming an economic powerhouse? When they started adopting many of the capitalistic structures, right? China is extraordinarily capitalistic, yet they have communist political systems, right? And so I'll take this moment now to say that there is no nation in the world that is 100% communist or socialist or capitalist or the next, which is fascist, right? They don't exist. And so all nations have a little bit of everything to a certain degree, right? So let's not forget that even the United States, who is very, very, very capitalist, they have public things. They have leftist type things. So it's very important to understand which pieces of these things does each country take. Canada, for example, we have very socialistic things, right? Our healthcare is very socialistic. Our education is socialistic. So socialistic. I don't even know if that's a word. Socialist. So we have to make sure that we are picking and choosing what we believe is best for our nation, and that's what our politicians do. So your leaders are going to say, we want to do this, or we want to do that, and they're going to draw from more capitalistic thoughts or socialistic thoughts, or fascist thoughts maybe, or communist thoughts maybe, right? So, and then they're going to create their economy in what they believe is best for our nation, which is what Canada does, which is what US does, which everyone just does. They do what they believe is best, right? So the next is fascism. And fascism is an extreme right system. They do have free markets, yet they are non-democratic, right? So they have free markets like capitalists, but they're non-democratic like communists, okay? No opposition is allowed. Think about fascist Germany, right? They use force as means of control. They allow privatized ownership. If you watch any fascist Germany movies, you'll see there are shops, there are privately owned businesses, right? So they allow it. They understand that is good for the economy for certain types of things. But of course, if you go against maybe some of their ideology, they're going to shut you down, or they're going to cause you to do different things, right? They use military power to control. And it restricts individual freedoms. Again, so let's look at this, right? This is not good. Restricting individual freedoms, not good. Force as a means of control, not good. Non-democratic, not good. Free markets can be good. So now I want to highlight Nazi Germany. Like if you think about Hitler, Hitler was a fascist leader, okay? But he was elected into power. He did not take over power through force. He was elected into power. So when Hitler was coming up through the ranks of politics, Germany was not fascist. Germany was socialist. So you want to understand that an individual like Hitler can change your political system. Well, let me backtrack. Hitler was not elected in the socialist Germany. Hitler was running for the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and he did not win the election. He was appointed chancellor later, and then as chancellor, he took over power. So he was running as a socialist and then took over power and turned Germany into a fascist state. And once he took over power, there were no more elections, right? So again, Germany was not specifically socialist or fascist or communist or capitalist in entirety. It had parts of all, right? But it's good to understand that Hitler ran as a socialist, so but turned it into an extremist situation using his own power, right? So it's important to understand individuals can corrupt things, systems can be corrupted. And you can see in lots of different political leaders that happens, right? When you have good leadership, it shows through very much. When you have bad leadership, that also shows through very much. And so whatever political party that you live under or is in power in your country, you need to understand what are their goals, right? And so if we look at Canada, what are our economic goals for our nation, right? If we have common goals and if our leaders have these same goals, then they should be using these goals to implement certain types of policies. And so we're going to go through a few goals, and then I'm going to ask you to research your own goals on your own through the text, and then we're going to post some information online so we can kind of have full notes together. And so, one, political stability. An economic goal of Canada is to be politically stable, right? Without political stability, long-term planning suffers because you don't know what you can or cannot do in the future because you don't know what the outlook of politics is going to look like. This promotes investor confidence. Political areas in the world that lack political stability, it's tough to get investment. You know, people aren't necessarily encouraged to want to go to these places because they are scared that their investment's going to die, right? Political stability helps economic growth because people can plan, money can come in, etc., etc. Uncertainty is the opposite, right? Like, if there's an uncertain situation, people run. People aren't willing to put their money away or put their money into things because there's fear, right? No one wants that. No one needs that. It is a difficult situation to be in. 2, economic goal, reduce public debt. And this is probably laughable to many of you if you follow economics at all because of the amount of debt that keeps on piling up through so many of our nations, right? So in reality, an economic goal should be to keep spending in check, okay? And it does not mean that debt is not something that we should ever take. Debt can be very, very useful, but to seeing the debt of many countries rise substantially, rise to greater than our GDP levels, it's debilitating for planning. It's debilitating for future investments, right? knowing that the debt is at certain levels makes it impossible for us to get out of this debt. It's just a burden for our generations forever and ever and ever, right? So the theory is government should want to keep spending in check and save when we can and spend when we need to, and not just spend. And I'll mention this. It's very difficult to look at some of these long-term goals as a political party, because some of these long-term goals are beyond these incumbent leaders' terms, right? So this government wants to stay in power, so they're going to make decisions based on them getting reelected, yet that decision might be counter to a long-term plan that they should have and that they even know, yet they want to appease the public so they can get reelected, because the public often doesn't know some of these long-term plans or even understand them, which is problematic. So I mentioned this, don't want to sacrifice for future prosperity. If you have lots of debt, faith in your nation is a little bit lower, the value of your debt is lower. All these kinds of things, you want to ensure that your country does not get too big of a debt, okay? Because ultimately, if you default on debt, the value of your currency is going to go down, value of your investor confidence, value of your dollars will go down, right? So you don't want that, that's for sure. Next, economic growth. Yes, every nation wants to grow. That's every nation. There's no nation that does not want to grow. We want to increase our production and consumption of goods and services for our people, right? We want our production possibilities frontier to shift out. We want that to increase, right? Hopefully you remember what the PPF is. We want that to get bigger, so that the point that's unattainable, eventually we want to be able to attain that point, right? We don't want that to shrink. We don't want that to be stagnant. We want to continue to grow, to do more, and to consume more, make more, and produce more, right? Innovation does this, technology does this, population does this, more skilled labor does this, becoming more efficient does this. All these kinds of things allow for economic growth. So if you believe that we want to do more economic growth, that leads to thinking about capitalism, right? As we say, the privatization, the self-interest, those kinds of things are capitalistic things in nature. But the other trade-off is to think about at what cost do you want economic growth? And I know we talked about this before. Are you willing to clear-cut your forests? Are you willing to pollute? What are you sacrificing for economic growth, right? So while these are all goals, at what cost at some times, right? So we want to make sure we think about those things as well. Next, increase productivity and efficiency. Again, similar, we want to be more efficient, we want to be more productive because we want our PPF to increase. Like, there's nothing wrong with wanting to be able to do more, right? That doesn't have to be negative. This is a very kind of innocent thing. We want to be faster and better, right? There's no negative to that. We want to be able to use our scarce resources more efficiently, right? Because if we use them more efficiently, they can be used for other things, save time, all these kinds of things. I think it's fairly straightforward. Competition. As a nation, as a company, we are going to be more competitive if we are more productive and more efficient. We're going to be able to compete with other nations faster, better, etc., etc. So the next few: equitable distribution of income, price stability, full employment, viable balance of payments and stable currency, economic freedom, and environmental stewardship are ones that I want you to read the text, and then I want you to fill in some questions and some sheets that I'm going to post on Edsby so that we all can have a full note. So at this point in time, go back to the text, read these, and then start posting strong points that you believe should be there, okay? And so that therefore we'll have a consolidated note, okay? So once you've done this, we'll check back in to make sure that we have a good full note together. Thank you.